Good morning.
Good morning.
Well, like Dad said, I did just recently get off work, so I apologize ahead of time if any yawns sneak up on me while I'm speaking, but I'll try my best. Due to the limited amount of time that I have this morning, I'm not going to get too much into depth about the Middle Eastern conflict and all of that stuff that I did learn about and experience while in the Middle East. But more so just share a little bit about the places we visited, both biblical sites and modern sites, and show you some pictures just so you have an idea of what my time spent there was like. So for my EMU cross-cultural, I did choose to go to the Middle East. Spent about 3.5 months there, from January to April. The spring semester of my sophomore year at EMU. And how I'll do this presentation, I have kind of a slide that highlights the first country or area that we were at, and then I'll show you a few pictures from that area before I move on to the next one. Some pictures I'll say a little bit about, others will just be there for you to look at. So first, we flew into Amman, Jordan. That was the first location that we started our cross-cultural, and we spent about 2 weeks there. Some of the main cities that we visited include Amman, Petra, Aqaba, Jerash, Wadi Rum, and Wadi is the word for valley, and Mount Nebo. We saw places like the Jabbok River, which is involved in the story of Jacob, also the Jordan River, ancient Petra, the Arcs of Hadrian, spent some time swimming and relaxing at the Red Sea, and also saw many ancient Roman and Greek ruins. And one day we did also go down to the MCC building and spend some time there talking and having lunch with them. This is just a picture of downtown Amman. It was very late at night, as you can tell, so not many people were out wandering about. This is the Jabbok River, where our leader told us the story of Jacob. We took some notes, and that was the first biblical site that we kind of saw on the trip, so it was a good kickstart to the next couple months. This is the Arc of Hadrian, one of the ancient ruins that we saw, one of the first of many, and it was very cool to see just how such old monuments and buildings still exist overseas, something that we do not have a lot of here just because of history. More of the ruins. And I do not recall the name of this valley, but I remember that it was huge, and there were just a lot of valleys weaving in and out, and it was just amazing to look out over. We spent about 20 minutes there just spending our own individual time looking out over the valley. It was very beautiful. And this, I'm sure many of you have seen, whether in the Indiana Jones movies or just from knowing your history, but this is Petra, and this is the first, it's kind of neat because this is the first part of it that you see when walking into it. It's a very long tunnel, well, not a tunnel, but 2 caves, not very wide, enough for a couple of people, and you walk through it, keep walking, don't see anything, and then you can start to see this carving in the rock as you come out. So it's very, it built up the anticipation. Just some more of Petra that we got to see. And it was massive. We spent, I think we had about 4 or 5 hours to spend just walking around there on our own. This is in Wadi Rum, which is kind of a desert valley. We spent a couple of days there staying in these tents with some Bedouins. And we celebrated with them, shared feasts with them, and just got to sit and talk and see what their lifestyle was like. And this was one of my favorite times spent in Jordan, was staying in this wadi. While we were there, we went on a camel ride through the desert, which was an experience. It was a lot of fun, but it was also quite interesting. Just some of my closest buddies from the trip up on a mountain overlooking the desert. And another very fun part for me, as many of you know, I love playing soccer. And me and some of my friends, while we were staying in the desert camp, got to play soccer with many of the Bedouins who lived there. We played for about an hour and a half, and it was just dirt. Played on the dirt with those little metal, almost like clothesline frame type things as goals, but it was a lot of fun, and we enjoyed it very much. And that's a picture of all of us that played together. This is the Red Sea. It looks modernized. It had a lot of benches and umbrellas and stuff because they do get a lot of visitors. But the water was very cold, and so we didn't get to do too much swimming, but it was neat. There were a lot of colorful corals 5 feet below the water. We had to be careful not to cut our feet on them while we were in the water, but it was very pretty, and it was awesome just to know that I was swimming in the Red Sea, which not many people get to do. Again, just looking out over the valley. And this, anybody have a guess of what this view is? This was on top of Mount Nebo, looking out over the Promised Land. And while we were up there, our leader read us the story of where the Israelites were promised the Promised Land. And this was kind of the last stop we made in Jordan before going into Israel. So it was a neat last pit stop to make. So the next part of our trip was spent in Palestine, or the West Bank. This was one of the highlights of my trips and one of my favorite parts. We spent about 3 weeks there living with host families in Beit Sahor, which is a small village. It's about 80% Christian. It was very close to Bethlehem. It was within walking distance or driving distance, whichever way you could get there. And during this time, each day or each morning, we studied at a place called ATG. I forget what the A stands for, but the TG is tourist group. And we studied, had lectures on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, Middle Eastern history. Each morning we took Arabic lessons for 3 hours, and also the current events of what was going on. And then each afternoon we would go out on kind of a field trip just to see different places in Palestine and that would relate to what we had studied that morning. We visited many biblical sites and Palestinian towns like Ramallah, Hebron, Bethlehem, the shepherds' fields where the shepherds would have seen the star when they were called to see Jesus. And like I said, this was one of the highlights of my trip. This was the house that I stayed in with my host family, and that's a picture of my host parents. They were some of the nicest people I've ever met. This was in the shepherd's fields, just overlooking part of the West Bank. And an interesting point I'll point out, I'm sure many of you have heard of the Israeli settlements, and this just gives you an idea of what they're like. All this area around here is Palestinian territory, but the Jewish settlements that they build, this is one right here, that they just throw up in the middle of the territory kind of and claim that area as their own. So you see many of those throughout the West Bank. And we're getting to the wall. This is in Hebron, and I put this picture up because Hebron is a unique city because this half is Palestinian and there's a wall down the middle, and right over here is a road, but everything on the left side is Israeli. So the city is kind of divided in half. And as you'll see, the Israelis, even on the Palestinian side, have a lot of military people just up on the roofs, keeping watch, protecting themselves, as they would say. And so you feel very weird just walking around the city because you can feel the tension. But it was uncomfortable for many of us. I'll go back to the wall real quick, just to tell you a little bit more about it. The wall, talking with many Palestinians, many of the Israelis see it as protection for them, as I'm sure you may know. But for the Palestinians, it is both mentally and literally a separation. For example, not many Palestinians are able to go into Jerusalem. My host father was fortunate. He, because of his work, was able to travel in occasionally. But the paths that they were able to once take to work may have been a 5-minute drive from here to there. But with the wall built up, some of them it may take hours, or it may take 1 hour just to get to work because they have to drive around the wall rather than going straight through. And so it creates a lot of stress, unhappiness, and things like that for the Palestinian people. Just makes their lives very difficult. This is in Hebron. This is Abraham and Sarah's tombs. So that was very exciting to see. And this was at the end of one of our hikes through Wadi Kelt. It was a long hike, I think about 6 hours. And as we were walking out, we got to overlook the old city of Jericho. Most of it was in ruins. This is obviously modern buildings, but right down in this area was where it was thought to have been Jericho. So that was very exciting. And also while we were there, we got to spend some time on an olive tree farm. It's Palestinian owned, and the money it raises and the work they do is just to improve the Palestinian lives and work towards peace. And so we spent an afternoon up there planting olive trees and helping them on their farm. Next, we went to Israel. And as I'll get to in a little bit, the very first 3 days of the transition from Palestine to Israel was very difficult. We went from staying with host families in Palestine to staying with host families on a settlement that was very close to Beit Sahur, which is where we stayed with our Palestinian families. Our leader advised us not to tell our Palestinian families specifically where we were going next, because as he was sure, if they found out that we were going to stay on the settlement, it would create uncomfortable feelings for them. So that was hard for us, especially after having lived with them and gotten to like them a lot and appreciate them, to go and live with the people who were oppressing them. So after those 3 days, we went and stayed at Jerusalem University College, where we also studied a lot of architecture and history of the land and stuff like that. And in the afternoons, again, we would travel all over Israel, to the Galilee, to Ashkelon, Caesarea Philippi, Beersheba, Tiberias. We saw tons of places. Every day was spent traveling and studying. And after that, we had our free travel. We then studied a week at a French convent in the old city of Jerusalem, where we studied Hebrew. We walked the Via Dolorosa, saw the Garden of Gethsemane, Calvary, and much more. From there, we went and spent a week at Oranim, which was a Jewish kibbutz. And lastly, we stayed a week in Nazareth, where we volunteered at the Nazareth village and walked the Jesus Trail. I'll show you some pictures of our time in Israel. This was the host family we stayed with in Efrat, the settlement. This is overlooking the Galilee. It's very beautiful and a lot of green compared to the rest of the country. Mount of Olives is across from Jerusalem. Now it is a huge cemetery. If someone in a Jewish family dies, they have a big ritual. You can see them across the valley walking to the Mount of Olives, and it's just covered in tombs. During our time at JEC, we went, and I forget the name of the small city, but we stayed. Our house was probably right here, right along the Sea of Galilee. And that was a lot of fun. It was very pretty. We got to swim in the sea and also just spent some time traveling out and about from that area. But the Sea of Galilee was also very cold. And it's not what you would typically think of a sea. It's actually quite small. This is Capernaum, or the town of Jesus. The temple ruins there. And it is right along the Sea of Galilee. And as you know, this is where Jesus called some of his disciples to follow him and be fishers of men. From there, we went on to see Caesarea, where Paul was imprisoned. Caesarea Philippi, and I couldn't find very many good pictures of that, so I apologize. As I said, we also got to go on free travel. And me, those two guys you see there, and one other, for our first couple of days of our free travel, chose to go sailing with an Israeli friend of our group leader. And this was an experience. We had a very small boat, and the 3 days that we chose to sail, the waves were very choppy. We were, probably 5 or 6 foot waves, and on a small boat, it is not fun. A lot of us got seasick, but we stayed on for those 3 days, and we sailed from Ashkelon up to Joppa, or Jaffa, as it's called nowadays, which, as you know, is involved in the story of Noah and the whale. And this is on top of the roof of the French convent that we stayed in the old city. It was kind of neat because in the basement of this convent they have kind of blocked off is the original concrete road and kind of stage or whatever you want to call it of where they believe Jesus to be imprisoned when he was offered Barnabas or Jesus, and so they had that marked off, and it was cool to be down there and see that. It was very powerful. Overlooking the Wailing Wall, where the Temple Mount was, and the Dome of the Rock, which is now on the Temple Mount. And that is still the original wall of Herod's castle. This is a view from the Mount of Olives to the east of Jerusalem, overlooking the old city. As you can see, the original wall of the city is still standing. This is the tomb where they believed Jesus was buried after he was crucified. The Garden of Gethsemane. And of course, I don't believe that these are the original olive trees, but as you know, or may not, olive trees can live hundreds of years. So many of the trees were very, very old and had huge stumps. So the age of them they didn't know exactly, but it still gave you the feeling of kind of being very historical. We had a lecture from our professor. This is in the upper room, where the building where they would have had the Last Supper. So he read us the story when they had the Last Supper before Jesus was crucified. And now we're on to Nazareth. This is Nazareth Village, where we spent some time volunteering with the people who work there. And that was also a very fun time. We got to dress up as shepherds and stuff like that for a day and just walk around. The group that I was in got to help build an old house out of rocks, and so we were picking up heavy rocks and carrying them over and stacking them on top of each other to build an old-looking cottage. And as I said earlier, starting in Nazareth, going to Capernaum is where we walked the Jesus Trail, and this is along the Jesus Trail. It took us, I believe, 3 to 4 days to walk, and we had 3 different checkpoints along the way where we would stay the night before we continued. Again, the Jesus Trail. And this was near the end of the Jesus Trail atop the Mount of Beatitudes, overlooking the Sea of Galilee and Capernaum before we finished our hike. And as we were up there, we were read the Sermon on the Mount, which was also a very blessing experience. And that brings an end to our time in Israel. And after this, we spent the next couple of weeks first in Turkey, then on to Greece, and finally in Rome and other places in Italy, following the footsteps of Paul in the book of Acts. I don't know, some of you may have heard of Sailing Acts, a book written by Linford Stutzman. He was the leader of our trip, so he kind of took us on that journey, which was very cool to follow Paul at the end of our trip. We studied the life of Abraham and walked the Abraham Trail in Turkey, which happened to be on my birthday, so that was a fun time. And visited places like Ephesus, where he taught to the Ephesians, Antioch and the first church, Tarsus, and then eventually to Corinth and Athens, and lastly Rome. This is just a Kurdish village in Turkey. Modern Ephesus. And that is the first church in Antioch. It was under construction and had a lot of falling rocks, so we weren't allowed to actually get up close to it. But it was still neat to see where Paul would have started that first church. Corinth, up on the mountain. Again, some more ruins of Corinth. And in Greece, looking at the Acropolis of the Greek gods, the Temple of Athena, and many more. A lot of that was also under construction, so unfortunately we didn't get to see too much of that. Colosseum in Rome. The first Olympic stadium in Greece, which was awesome to go to. We actually had our own little races while we were there. It was fun. And towards the end of our time there, we got to go to the Vatican and actually hear the Pope speak, which was also very cool. So just to sum it up, my overall experience in the Middle East, I gained a new, significant appreciation and understanding of the Old Testament, one which I definitely have not had before. The Old Testament, compared to the New Testament, can be a little more slow to read through, but experiencing it as we were reading through it was very special to me and brought a new light and understanding to the Old Testament. Also established a unique connection to God, having walked and studied in the Holy Land where Jesus lived. Not many people get to do that, and it's a very unique experience and can bring a lot to the foundation of your faith. I learned a lot about the Middle Eastern current events, and the biblical relevance was probably most significant to me. Although the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was important, I appreciated the biblical part of it the most, I think. And now, reading through the Bible, it's very cool because I can picture the scenes of many of the towns and places that they talk about having visited, most of them. And so it adds a special feature to learning and studying the Bible for me. So what's next for me? This past spring, I graduated EMU with a bachelor's degree in biology, pre-med. This coming January, I will begin PA school at Murphy-Deming College, which is in Fishersville, Virginia. And that will take about 2.5 years, so by that time, I hope to be able to practice medicine. And possibly one day go on to get my medical doctorate. And at this point, I plan on staying in Harrisonburg area, at least through school and probably for a little bit after that. So I just wanted to thank you all very much for your support, both financially, motivationally, just as a congregation through my 4 years of college and even way before that in my growing up. It's meant a lot to me, and it's definitely been a big support through that time. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation.
WBTL, we believe in